Hello, this is Dr. Lisa Moyer. Welcome to the lecture and talk on housing and poverty for disadvantaged families. We will start out by talking about affordable housing. There is a misconception in American society that there's plenty of adequate and affordable housing, and that is actually not true. And the group that is affected the most profoundly by this are families. So you notice on that second bullet point, it says a family with one adult working full-time at minimum wage cannot afford fair market rent for a two-bedroom apartment anywhere in the United States. And that is actually true. So this is problematic. There's nowhere in this country that an adult that is working full-time at a minimum wage job can pay for a two-bedroom apartment at the fair market rent for that area. And that may not seem like a big deal if it's just the adult, but oftentimes this is an adult with children. So single parent family household, or it could be a two-parent family household, but only one of them was able to find work. We still have a very high unemployment rate at this time, and it is difficult for people to find full-time work. So considering whether or not they're children, it sort of changes how we feel about this issue and how we view it. It could also be that there are family members living with the working adult that have a disability of some sort, and that will require maybe children to stay home or another adult to stay home to help the family member that needs the caregiving. And again, that's problematic if you can't afford housing. If fair market rent isn't really fair and affordable to the most vulnerable of American families, you have to ask yourself, what's the point? Because that is the point. It is supposed to be fair, it is supposed to be affordable. And there are options where families can apply for subsidized housing, but the subsidized housing typically has, on average, a waiting list of 2 years to get in. And even living in places where there are subsidized housing allowed, which basically means that the family would pay what they can, no more than 30% of their income. It's based on a sliding fee scale that the government establishes, and the government pays the rest of the rent. So landlords or building owners have to agree to this. And that's a wonderful idea in theory, but what has happened is when you have a lot of people living in poverty, living in one area together, that creates its own host of issues and problems. And so you try to get people from neighborhoods that own homes or small buildings to accept subsidized housing as well, but that can be an issue too for the other neighbors who don't necessarily want poverty in the neighborhood they live in. Also, many times in states like Illinois, where there is a financial crisis, people are worried they're not going to get paid, so they may not agree to do that. Okay, so what is affordable housing? I'm sure you're familiar with this concept as we talk about it a lot in FCS. Affordable housing is when an individual or family is paying 30% or less of their income for housing. So that includes an apartment, a house, renting, owning, a trailer, whatever the case may be. And when families pay more than that, it's considered unaffordable. And families struggle with their budget when they have to pay more for housing, which is the case for a lot of families today. So at least 12 million Americans pay more than 50% of their income for housing. I mean, that's even more than 30%. And 1 out of every 2 households with children in the United States face poverty-related housing issues. And we're going to talk about what those are. So first we have cost burdens. Cost burdens can include not being able to afford the housing, not having to pay much more of the income that families have for housing, than what is considered affordable. Maybe that the condition of the building that they live in, or the home that they live in, or the house, the trailer, whatever the case may be, it may be run down, undesirable, and they're not able to fix it, and the landlord is not performing to his moral duty and legal duty, which would mean he would have to fix it. So families oftentimes find themselves living in places where there's more than just the housing cost itself. There's costs associated with living there that they didn't plan on, and that add even more burden. This can also include transportation. If people are living in an area where public transportation isn't available, then they're going to want to live close to a town or a city. However, that's not always the case. And then, of course, is poor housing quality. On the next slide, I give more examples of this, but I think that you're familiar with what this probably means. It can be a broken banister, windows that won't lock, leaky faucets, leaky toilets, toilets that don't work, structural problems, so there may be a problem with the foundation, but the housing the quality of the place that they're living in is not up to standard. And I'm going to tell you why this is a problem in just a moment, or why you should think it's a problem. Then there's overcrowding. And I alluded to this a little bit when I talked about the subsidized housing, but we should talk about it some more. And the way that I usually do this when I'm in person in a classroom is I ask my students to close their eyes and think about a time when they've either visited somebody or relatives have visited them, and there's been a lot of people staying in one small space together. So it could be for a holiday, it could be for a birthday, it could be for a trip, whatever. Maybe you've put 6 people in a hotel room with 2 double beds, and that's 2 people are sleeping on the floor, whatever. It really doesn't matter. I'm just wanting you to envision a time when that's happened. And what your mental attitude is like when you're living under those conditions. Where at first it might seem kind of exciting because usually it's what we're talking about. It's for some type of an event. It does wear on you after a while, doesn't it? We don't have a lot of space. We saw this evidenced in the Poor Children movie we watched, when one of the daughters, when they're living in the hotel, was frustrated because her brother had to sleep on the floor. She had to climb over him to get to the bathroom, and she said, "There's just nowhere to go to be alone." And that's a very real concept, and it's a very real problem. Families need space. Everyone needs space. And when you overcrowd people and it's on a day-to-day basis, and there's no choice about it, that stress can lead to other types of tensions and problems. And so it can lead to fighting. It can lead to substance abuse. It can lead to people leaving, becoming homeless. It can lead to a whole host of problems on its own. So overcrowding is not desirable. And if you're crowding a lot of people living in poverty in one building or one area or one part of a city, that exacerbates the issue. So now it's not just within the home, but also in the neighborhood itself, it's overcrowded. There's too many people squished in one area, and that never goes well. It's a very stressful situation, and we're talking about vulnerable families that are struggling to pay their bills and make a living. They don't need any more stress. Finally, unsafe housing. Did I talk about that? I guess I kind of did in conjunction with the poor housing quality, cost burdens. But yeah, the same idea. So things can not only be poor housing quality, but they can be unsafe. So the window that doesn't lock, well, that's unsafe. Somebody could break in and get into the house, or a small child, could get out and get lost or get hurt or get taken. So even they may just seem like maybe at the very surface level, this is just a problem of how it looks, but it also can be unsafe, leading to more problems. And then there's lead paint. And another big misconception is that there is no more lead paint used in buildings that people live in. This is untrue. There's still a lot of lead paint out there, actually. The older the building, the greater the likelihood that you will find lead paint. And the older the building, the less expensive it typically is particularly for renting apartments. And so you find the most vulnerable, financially vulnerable families having to live in places where their children are exposed to lead paint. And it can be found, it's invisible to the naked eye. Lead dust is invisible, but it settles on the floor, it settles on children's toys. It can contaminate the water, especially a big concern when you're feeding babies formula. Workers can be exposed to lead in the job, on the job, construction, demolition, etc. Carry it home in their clothes, or it can be in the soil around a house where children play. Lots of ways for children to become exposed. And the reason I emphasize children is because they're the ones where they're still having their brain development is carrying on. It's not done. It's not finished. A lot of brain development occurs at very young ages, so the very youngest of children are the most vulnerable to having some type of issues from being exposed to lead paint. And that can include like learning disabilities, it can include illness, it can include brain misfunction or brain trauma, brain injury. It's a very dangerous thing to be exposed to. And that's why buildings are no longer allowed to use it, but getting it out is still an ongoing problem. We probably wouldn't be talking about it if it was a problem that only the wealthy dealt with. They would go into a house and get rid of the lead paint. But when you're talking about vulnerable families that don't have a big disposable income like that, they can't afford to do it. Okay, just some more talk about poor housing quality. But I also wanted to spend a minute and talk about the effects on child development beyond just brain development. So there are other things that you should be concerned about when, say, there's exposed wiring in the house, broken windows, there are rodents, peeling paint, poor lighting, overcrowding, etc. So poor housing quality has been shown in the research. A very clear link has been made in the research throughout the years that it can cause, and it's not just associated with it, it causes physical health problems like asthma, allergies, or even neurological problems, and it affects the socio-emotional health. So it can affect playing and learning, it can hinder other social activities and other socializing. All of this affects behavioral, cognitive, and emotional health. So now this becomes an issue of it's not just families living in a crowded place and maybe being stressed out, and not everybody having a house or having a nice place to live, but it's affecting the welfare of American children. And in one of the wealthiest countries in the world, this is actually quite alarming to people when they first discover this. So it's dangerous for children to be exposed to these conditions. It affects how they develop. And you think about that, a good example of this, if you think about a child that's living under these conditions, their grades are affected, their academic ability, their behavior, their health, their friendships. And this is all affected by just the housing quality. We just isolate the housing quality. Well, they're going to be more likely to not do well in school, possibly drop out, not get into college. And if there is a dropout rate, or maybe even dropping out of just college alone, it's much more difficult to land a good paying job with good benefits. And that is going to make that struggle to get out of poverty even more difficult. And so, I mean, you think we're just talking about one area, housing and child development, and then looking at the long-term effects. And that's why I always say poverty is complicated, because when you start compounding all these different types of issues, you start seeing that it is a very complicated issue, and you can take care of one thing, you can put a family into nice housing, but it doesn't get rid of the past, doesn't get rid of the exposure to the poor housing and how the effect it had on child development up until that point. You can't erase it and start over. It's not like Monopoly where you can just dump the pieces on the floor and start over. So I want you to consider that. When we talk about housing, we also have to talk about homelessness. Another issue that is very underestimated in the United States, probably because it's mostly invisible. So I I don't know how I wanted to say that. I guess I just want you to think about when you're driving around Charleston, Mattoon, you don't typically see encampments. So you don't see places where people are living in cardboard boxes or sitting on the streets like you would in Chicago. So if you are walking around the streets of Chicago, you will see people on the streets, sometimes literally sitting on the ground on a piece of cardboard, oftentimes begging for help. That it makes homelessness more visible, but the majority of homelessness we don't actually see. Um, Chronic homelessness, meaning that it's repeated or it's long term, only accounts for 16% of the total homeless population. So that means there's a small percentage of people that are chronically or long term homeless. Most homelessness is temporary, and so it's hard. This makes it a methodological problem. So if you're talking about an issue where a family may be homeless a couple nights a month because they are doing what is called couch surfing and they're staying with relatives, they may stay with Aunt Mary for 2 weeks. Aunt Mary says, okay, I can't take it anymore. You're going to have to go somewhere else, or I can't afford it. So then they live in their car for a night or two until they're able to find somewhere else. Maybe they stay with another relative or a friend or a coworker for a few nights. Maybe they're able to save some money doing that, and then they can get into a hotel for a few nights. So it's not a chronic issue where they're on the street every single night, but that family, because they're lacking a stable home that they can go to every evening, they are considered homeless. And that's very difficult to count. That's why I say it's a methodological issue. When you're trying to talk about statistics and how big the problem is, because it's invisible, because it's hard to count people that are staying with friends and relatives or living in hotels, couch surfing, etc., it's hard to accurately say, this is how many people are homeless and this is why it's a problem. It just basically means a lack of permanent housing. And so that includes staying with a friend. That you may have a roof over your head that evening, but it's not your roof, your house. You're staying there temporarily, so you're considered technically homeless. I guess one of the reasons I'm really beating this into you or repeating this over and over again is to remember that you can only count reasonably people that seek resources for the homeless, so shelter or food, job skill training, counseling, some other type of resource. You can count them and say, okay, this 300 people come every week to this center to get help. So there's at least 300 people in this area that are homeless. But if you don't see it, you can't count it. You can't. It's impossible to complete a study and ask every single person in a city, has someone stayed with you, and keep track of everyone. And when we don't see, particularly Americans, when we don't see problems, there is no problem. So if it doesn't affect me personally or I don't see it, I don't even know it exists. And if I don't know it exists, I'm not going to be willing to help out or be empathic about the issue. Hopefully that makes sense. Okay, hopefully this is still carrying on from where I just left off. Because I may have made a mistake. But anyways, families, so unexpected, unforeseen, unplanned issues result in families becoming homeless. Individuals, on the other hand, it depends on whether they're over 18 or under 18. And there are adults over 18. The factors that cause homelessness among this population are different than the ones that typically cause it for individuals that are under 18. So adults, unemployment is a common reason. Disability, often due to war or military service. Substance abuse, mental health issues, etc. When you look at youth, then you will find different reasons like family conflict, abuse in the home, financial instability. So maybe they just feel like their parents can't afford them, so they leave, try to get help, or even sexual orientation, which is becoming a bigger problem than I think a lot of family researchers expected. The more we uncover, the more we realize that a lot of children or teenagers are kicked out of their home simply because they are open about their sexuality. The way that I want to finish this PowerPoint is to have you guys watch From Happy to Homeless, Teens in Trouble. It's a 2020 episode, so it's a little under an hour. And I have some questions in the Dropbox for you to answer. So you will get class activity points once you do that. The only way you can do it is by watching the movie, because otherwise you won't know how to respond, and I'll be able to tell. So this is going to conclude my part of it. You guys will click on the link that is on your PowerPoint or even search for it if you have trouble with that on Google. And just remember, I am going to be activating the test soon. It's a take-home exam, open book, open note. Yeah, all the explanation will be on the exam itself, but let me know if you have questions. Okay? Thank you.